Hi, I'm Preston. I'm here with William Lowe today, and William and I have done a number of these roadmap talks, and we decided that we should resume them. And so here we are. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about flickers of movement, which is something that you should probably know about and pay attention to in your recovery. And William's going to start us off with a little bit about flickers of movement, and then we will expand on the topic in our discussion. So go ahead, William.
Yeah, thanks, Ralph. So one of the things I noticed when I first started my journey in recovery after stroke was this phrase "flickers of movement," which was being thrown around when I was receiving treatment in hospital from my physical therapist, and they would always tell me that I had flickers of movement whenever I performed an exercise. And basically, what this term meant, in case any of you haven't heard of it, it's this idea that whenever you perform an exercise in your recovery after stroke, what generally happens is that if your brain has a breakthrough or if your brain is able to learn something, the next day, what you'll find is that you might be able to move your fingers a little bit more than before, or maybe you might be able to move your legs a little bit more before. So basically, what would happen is the next day you would be able to wake up with a little bit of movement, which is so small that you might not be able to see it, but you might be able to just feel it. And basically, this is your brain telling you that this is your opportunity to jump on this small movement, which it's learnt, so that you can turn it into an even bigger movement and make it permanent and allow you to progress in your recovery after stroke. So I understand that recovery after stroke can be very challenging for a lot of people, and it can be very difficult to see changes on a day-to-day basis, especially if you're going through it every single day. And I'm just wondering, Ralph, in your experience of recovery after stroke, helping other stroke survivors, coaching them in their recovery, as well as yourself, have you ever come across any instances where you've noticed that you've you've been able to observe some flickers of movement after an exercise which maybe you might have performed, or after you've suggested something to people who you've helped in their recovery after stroke?
Well, I I'm a big believer in paying attention to everything that goes on. I'm real good at that. I'm kind of detail oriented, and so I think one of the first things that people should do is realize that in stroke recovery, it's important to pay attention to a lot of the little details, because I think that something like this is something that you could easily miss if you weren't. Um, I I didn't know about this when I was in my recovery, so but I did experience with my hand. I did experience some after a week or a couple weeks after my stroke. I got a little teeny tiny movement in my hand, and I mentioned it to the occupational therapists because they had told me to try and do something called mental imagery or mental practice. So this is the idea where you actually, I suppose in a sense, I don't know, you're trying to use your brain to create a flicker of movement, to get a little bit of movement. So they told me to basically stare at my hand and try and think about moving it. And at that time, I didn't know anything much about moving it with your other hand, or I might have tried that. So I didn't. And I thought they were crazy at first, of course, but their plan was better than my plan because I didn't have a plan. I didn't know that much about stroke. There I was in a wheelchair with an arm that didn't and a hand that didn't work. So I tried it and I got a little bit of movement one day. I'm talking an eighth of an inch. So I mentioned it, and they were all excited. And so this may play into the whole concept of flickers of movement, because I think that even if they're slightly different, what you do after them is similar. So they said, well, great, great. I'm going, great. Like an eighth of an inch of movement. Great. Okay. Well, and then they explained to me that you can generally build on something like this. And I found that to be true. I worked on it right away that day and every day after that. And, within a week or two, within a week, I was moving about an inch. Should do it with my affected hand. I was moving about an inch, and within, 3 or 4 weeks, I wasn't at full extension, but I was opening my hand, with that kind of a curve anyway, kind of a natural curve the way your hand goes, but not full extension. So I can't honestly say that I observed anything like that with the people I was working with. Maybe I didn't know it, because I wasn't there all the time. So these things could have occurred when when I wasn't around. But I certainly noticed, I had one person I worked with for 5 years, and every time that she made a new movement, I made note of it. Or if she got a greater range of motion, I made note of it, and I tried to work on it to build on it, because at that time, that was all I knew to do. Sorry for the long answer there, but so you think that mental practice could actually maybe create a flicker of movement? Are they similar in your mind or different?
Oh yeah, definitely. So what you described there, with the mental practice and where you notice that you were able to move your fingers about an eighth of an inch, that was your brain telling you that it had gotten back a flick of a movement which it used to do before you had your stroke. So that was basically your brain getting back a flicker of movement. Um, and and even though your therapist might not have used the term flickers of movement to describe it at the time, they were smart enough to notice that this was a sign of a movement which could be turned into something bigger with a lot more practice. Because the thing with flickers of movement is that they they come few and far between, in that your brain has to, like I said earlier, it has to experience a breakthrough in order for it to get back flickers of movement and give you a sign that you have to jump on this movement which it's learnt and make it a lot bigger, so that you're able to make progress or continue to make progress in your recovery after stroke. I think, in regards to your question about mental practice, I think that mental practice as a form of therapy, it can help contribute to encouraging your brain to get back flickers of movement. Because for those of you who have seen my presentation on the blueprint, on creating blueprint for your brain, what mental practice does from a neuroscience standpoint is, whenever you're mentally rehearsing a movement, what happens in the brain is that the part of the brain which controls the part of your body which is being mentally rehearsed, it actually gets a lot bigger. So with this increased size or increased activity, where you're mentally rehearsing that movement and you're turning on that part of your brain a lot more than it typically is being turned on in your recovery after stroke, you are guiding your brain towards making a breakthrough, or getting back some flickers of movement, which you can then build upon if you're lucky to see them the next morning.
Well, once I found out that, and they told me that I could build upon it, I was trying to open that hand all the time. Like when I was back in the room watching TV, I'd be trying to open that hand, and I was able to build on it, and that taught me something really valuable, which is basically the concept of that if you get some movement, you should jump on it and build on it. Now, I didn't know that in some of our previous conversations, you and I have talked about the fact that these flickers of movement don't stick around very long. Maybe I'll get you to talk about that. And before you do that, I'll tell people who are listening that I will put in the description a link to William's presentation on how the brain makes the blueprint. So when we refer to that, if you're interested, you can go to description and click on a link and see that video. So it's my understanding that these flickers of movement don't stick around. So you talk a little bit about that and why that makes it so important for you to pay attention and jump on it?
Yeah, sure. So one thing to keep in mind with recovery after stroke is there's no such thing as setting it and forgetting it. In other words, you can't just your brain doesn't operate the way it used to before your stroke. So before your stroke, you might have remembered that you were able to pick up new things quite quickly. You were able to, let's say if you were learning a new skill like throwing a ball, the next day you wouldn't forget it. You would retain the ability to throw a ball quite well, um, just like the previous day. Now, what happens in recovery after stroke is that, unfortunately, this muscle memory, which is the conventional term people would use to describe it, it's not as strong as before. So what this means is that whenever your brain does learn something new or get back a flick of movement in recovery after stroke, it means that it's giving you a signal to tell it that this movement is important enough that it has to store it in its permanent database. And the way to make sure that this movement is retained in your brain and your brain is able to remember it and actually use it and apply it in recovery after stroke forever is to quickly associate this movement with something else you're doing. So, for example, applying it to everyday activities, such as, I guess, opening up the fridge, or as you mentioned, Ralph, using your hand to open whenever you have the opportunity, so that your brain knows that this is something which it shouldn't forget, as it's something it's permanently using.
I didn't know that it, would forget it. I just figured I would take any and every opportunity to build on every, waking second. It's interesting they call it muscle memory, because it seems to me it's more like brain memory, because your brain's the thing controlling the muscles. But I know that that's a well-used term. And one time I was shooting a video on dealing cards, and I experienced something unusual. And I was aware of it at the time. I even said something to the cameraman. I've got it on, it's in the video. I edited it out when I made the video on dealing cards. And that was, I tried it both ways. I dealt with my right hand and pushed the cards out with my left hand. I also did it where I pushed the cards out with my right hand and dealt with my left hand. Because I thought that should show it both ways, and it's different types of movement, and I'm a big believer in symmetry. Well, I found that since I'd never pushed the cards out with my right hand before the stroke, I was pretty terrible at it, even though this hand works perfectly. Well, and the other hand works pretty well too. But what I found was, and I had this funny feeling when it happened, when I started pushing the cards out with my affected hand, all of a sudden, like, it clicked, and I could do it perfectly. I could do it 5 times better than with my unaffected hand, just because I'd always done it. And I just had this feeling that I reconnected with a chunk of movement. The whole thing, sliding the cards out, what your other fingers do, it just kind of back to that automatic mode that we're all trying to get back to. Now, there's a subject for another one of these conversations, getting back to automatic, which is kind of what we're talking about now in terms of the way the brain makes a blueprint. It's telling you something, you try and get it to store it in long-term memory, and the more you do that, the closer you are back to this kind of automatic mode, I call it, where you don't have to think about everything. So I thought that was kind of interesting, because I had a very definite feeling that I just reconnected completely with dealing cards at that moment.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. And one thing I should mention is that in my talk with the blueprint in your brain, basically, whenever you get back a flicker of movement, what another way to think about it is that it's basically your brain creating a scaffolding inside of itself of that movement which you got back. But the thing with this scaffolding or this blueprint, which is another way to refer to it, is that if you don't use that movement enough, or if you don't practice that movement enough, this scaffolding, it won't evolve into a blueprint, into a permanent blueprint of something, of a movement which you used to do before your stroke. So it's very important to keep practicing the movement, and I guess in introducing your brain to new ways of applying that movement which you've learned, so that it can gradually expand this blueprint and make it a lot more elaborate. Because when you look at the way that you used to perform skills before your stroke, you would perform these movements in different settings, and because you would perform them in different settings and different conditions, your brain would have a very good understanding of how to perform that movement. And the blueprint for performing that movement, it would be quite detailed and quite elaborate.
Right. Before our strokes, I know personally I had a bunch of fairly robust blueprints because unless I was taking on something completely foreign, I was able to do whatever I wanted, and I never thought about it because the brain's like automatic, because once these blueprints are well formed, you just call them up and you don't think about it. Of course, then you have a stroke and you're sitting there in the wheelchair and you go, how did I used to move this hand? Well, you had a blueprint for it, so you didn't have to think about it, and now you have to think about it, and that's that whole thing. So as I learn more and more about neuroplasticity, what it seems to me, what we're trying to do is take these flickers of movement, develop them into greater movement, try and create a blueprint, have your brain store that blueprint, and as you build up blueprints in your brain post-stroke, then you can start to forget about things. For example, I still think about my walking even 13 years later, but during the process of recovery, I would work on one thing, and once I got like heel-toe down, once I walked on my heels and got my whole heel-toe pronation thing down, I didn't really think about it anymore. So I'm still thinking about my walking all the time, but I was able to build like sort of mini blueprints for parts of it, whereas I don't have I still don't feel like I have a good overall blueprint for the entire walking process. So I still think about most every step I take, but I definitely noticed that as I progressed, and I didn't know to call them blueprints back then, but as I progressed with something, for example, I noticed that my leg didn't kick quite as well forward, so I worked on that little kick you do right after you pick your foot up. And once I got that down, again, it just sort of became a part of my gait. Now, I wish I could apply this to my hip dip, but I haven't been able to yet. On the other hand, I walk better than a lot of people, and I'm not unhappy. So this is just a very interesting subject to get back to these blueprints in automatic mode.
Yeah, that's right. And what you said there, it makes a lot of sense, and you've really hit the nail on the head. And might I add that in recovery after stroke, your brain is all the scaffolding which it needs in order to rebuild itself, just like to the way it was before you had a stroke. It might be a different brain because it's operating differently, but it's still able to do the same things the same way it used to. But it's up to you to guide your brain in the right direction to make this scaffolding, which it already has, into something more permanent. And the way to do this is to apply whatever you've learnt or whatever you've been able to get back in your recovery after stroke to real life in such a way that you're able to do it on such a consistent basis that your brain doesn't see the need to forget it, because your brain operates on a system where it prioritizes things which are important. And if it's not, if something isn't practiced regularly enough, then your brain is likely going to forget the correct way to do it.
Again, I didn't know, but I didn't know about blueprints and such, but I just jumped on it. And, one of the things, you know, using, using your, all your body parts, for everything that you can do, is real good because, like you were saying before, it's not like a set it and forget it thing. Now, you might, maybe what I was describing about pieces of my gait becoming set it and forget it, but the whole thing not. So what you're trying to do by jumping on a flicker or movement is reinforce it and try and build blueprints. It seems to me, going out on a limb here, that your brain has the ability to build little blueprints, and then as you build multiples, put more and more of it together. So if you, whatever movement you have, whether it's a flicker or whatever you got going on, it's important to try and build on it, period. It's important to pay attention to your body so you notice these things. I see a lot of people, they don't seem to be involved in their, you get them to do exercises, they seem to be somewhere else. I'm pretty focused, so when I was moving my hand, I'd be staring at it and trying to figure out a way to get more out of it. So, um, you got anything else, or should we wrap this up?
No, not particularly. I think you summed it up quite well. It's I think for recovery after stroke, you have to really have a stern eye for what's actually working and what's not. So what this means is you would, if you're doing a new exercise, the next day what you would do is be on the eye out, be on the lookout for flickers of movement like we described here, so that if your brain has learned something, and if it has, to jump on it and make sure you practice it enough so that your brain doesn't forget it and you're able to progress in your recovery.
Well, and I found the best way to do that is to do it all day, every day in your living. If you start to be able to pinch something, I would walk out to the mailbox every day and I would carry the mail. I would carry it cupped in my hand down so it could fall out if I let go, if I wasn't paying attention to my grip. Because even though in the beginning when I could grip, I would still like forget about it and relax my thumb, and next thing you know, I'd drop the mail. So, every day I walked out and got the mail. You do that something regularly, and you start to build one of these blueprints, I suppose. So, well, I guess we'll wrap this up. And there's William, as you know, and I know, there's an endless number of subjects, and what we're going to try and do is bring kind of more focused, shorter discussions to everybody, and we won't have any trouble with subject matter. We named a couple tonight, like getting back to automatic mode. Gosh, that's something that certainly could be explored more. And I know you've got other ones, so let's just keep doing them.
Yeah, sounds good. And if you guys have any other topics which you would like covered, or something specific which you would like to learn more about in your stroke recovery, we'll be interested to hear about those, because we really want to help stroke survivors around the world. Stroke recovery doesn't have to be a journey done by yourself. There is help available. Myself and Ralph, and I've known Ralph for a long time now, we really want to make sure stroke survivors around the world are well supported in their recovery after stroke.
Well, I'm glad you said that, and I'll make sure both of us are on Facebook. We both have groups. I put both of our group names in the description, where I'll also put that link to building how the brain builds blueprints. And if you have any ideas or suggestions, we're more than open to them. So I guess, William, and everybody watching and listening, we'll see you next time.